a lot of money,
Mm.
and people were clearly being headhunted as suitable candidates for common purpose. Now, some of them would go, well, all of them would go through a selection process where they were asked to fill in forms talking about their personal likes, dislikes, their professional desires, objectives, goals. So quite a lot of personal and professional information was collected about the potential trainees, and then the Common Purpose Advisory Board would select those people that it felt were the best candidates. Now, we knew that was going on then. We can prove it overwhelmingly now because we've got all the documentary evidence showing how this system works. So a key thing is that people don't just do the course. They don't just knock on Common Purpose's door and say, we'd like to be trained. Common Purpose comes and finds them. And when it has found a potential trainee, they then get a screening. Now, what I began to realize as we looked into this in more detail is that this first screening is very important because what they're actually doing is starting to make judgments about the person and their personality. So they want to know whether they are they're go-getters, whether they want to get on, whether they're ambitious, whether they are intelligent, whether they're good leaders anyway, and whether they've got power and control, particularly power and influence over financial budgets. Now, if somebody gets lots of ticks in the box from that psychological profiling, then they're invited on the Common Purpose course. Now, or a colleague of mine, was also doing research, and this is one of the things that I have been challenged on time and time again by people trying to undermine the evidence that we have. I've always said the same thing. I have a colleague who visited areas of the Common Purpose website, and on that website there were, connected with the website rather, there were documents talking about how Common Purpose was going to take over cities, and it was going to do this by selecting and controlling a few key people in each city. And if you think about it, this is quite a feasible thing. If the local mayor is on side, is Common Purpose trained, if the head of police, if the head of the city council, if the head of the hospital, if people within the education system, key people have all been brought online with Common Purpose, and they are working together for a common cause, then it is quite possible for those people to actually steer and manipulate the agenda in society.
Yes.
Now, if I come back to the training, we realised that people who'd been Common Purpose trained were not acting normally, in as much, in very simplistic terms, they were quite aggressive. They would lie to you, to your face, when you ask questions. Are you connected with this person? Are you trying to do this? They would lie. And they would also falsify documentation. And I can tell you that we're now in the happy position that we can show that this is still going on with Common Purpose. But we have to ask a question. Why would people want to lie to you? Why would they want to falsify documentation in order to cover up for Common Purpose?
Right.
I got part of an answer to this by the fact that fairly early on, I had several people brought to me. In the early days, they happened to all be ladies. But these ladies, if I take one of them as an example, she was young, 29, intelligent, professional. She'd done a Common Purpose course, but not felt very comfortable with it. In her organisation, she started to discover that her boss was making strange decisions. and she knew that if she carried out his decisions, the result was going to be disaster or not good. So she gradually tried to challenge him, and eventually he turned on her, and apart from making improper suggestions, you would get on better if you slept with me, or you'd get on better if you were a card-carrying member of the Labour Party. What began to spook her was that everywhere she went for help when she was being victimised, she was turned away, and those people were common purpose people. So we had the unique situation that a woman had done the training, had fallen foul of the organisation, but then found colleagues would turn on her.
Yeah.
So again, we get the impression of people acting quite strangely. Now, with this particular lady, when we were able to calm her down, and we said to her, you've done this course, you did a 48-hour course. What did you actually do on the course?
Yeah.
We were amazed that she couldn't tell us in any clear detail. She talked about arriving at the venue. She remembers having cups of coffee and talking to people. And then she described playing games. And when we said, well, what sort of games were they? She would be very vague. There were games where we had to write our profession on a paper plate. And we had groups, and we did things. But this was an educated professional woman, and she couldn't tell us about 6 months after she'd done the course very much about what had actually taken place. So this was the start of a clue where we were seeing people acting out of character, being aggressive, lying, victimizing a person. And then we also had a person who'd done the course who didn't seem to be able to remember much about it. And that was the basis that I began to research, and I began to get other people who were helping me on this. And that's when we began to understand more about actually how Common Purpose was doing the training process.
And Brian, does this in any way tie into some of the new developments that you briefly told me about before the program about NLP or neuro-linguistic programming?
Well, it does. As we researched, it became obvious to us that something was being done to the graduates which was changing their perceptions. I was approached by a gentleman who was extremely upset. He was about 40, 45 years old, and he told me a story about his wife getting involved with Common Purpose, and he described seeing her personality change. And he said it was very slow, and at one stage he thought his wife was well, in that possibly she was a little bit depressed. She went to the doctor couldn't find anything really wrong with her, but his wife became distant from him. Now this was a very happy marriage. They'd been married about 30 years, and the man said to me, I just watched my wife change. And eventually he discovered that his wife was having an affair with another man who he knew was also a graduate of Common Purpose. Now, again, I can feel perhaps listeners are saying, yes, but this is only one example. But we started to get more examples which were pointing to the fact that the course was doing something with people's minds and with their personalities. Now, I've never done this over a telephone interview before, but I'm going to try and do it, and I hope it comes out okay. But I knew a lady locally who had been a close friend, and the families had known each other very closely for about 21 years. And on one occasion, I asked her husband about Common Purpose, and he denied being involved. I subsequently discovered he was involved. So that meant that somebody that I knew as a close friend for 21 years was prepared to lie to cover up their involvement in Common Purpose. The lady herself was booked onto a Common Purpose course, and I waited until a few days after she'd done the 48-hour residential course, and I called her quite late, about 11:15 in the evening, to ask her some questions about Common Purpose. And I had prepared some questions which were designed to be a little bit prickly, to test her a little bit. So the first question I asked was, if it cost £3,500 to do the course, didn't that make it rather elitist? Didn't that make it difficult for people on lower incomes to do the course? And she gave me a very carefully worded answer, but the substance of her answer was that, well, Common Purpose was for a better class of person because it was about future leaders. So that was an interesting reply.
Yeah.
I then said to her, were there any coloured people on the course? Now, I know, I'm saying to you today, I know perfectly well that coloured people do the Common Purpose course, but I was interested to see what she said. And she told me that there weren't any coloured people on her course, but she was adamant that they did Common Purpose training. But this got her a little bit prickly. And I asked a couple more questions, and then eventually she said this to me, and I will try and repeat it exactly how it was said to me.
Right.
And I'm going to say, including the stuttering. She said, Brian, it's now 11 o'clock, and you've asked me all these questions about Common Purpose. And I don't know why you've asked me these questions, but I have been on a wonderful course, and I've met some wonderful people, and well, I am ready to take my place in society.
God.
Now that response told me that my long-term friend was gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was an extraordinary reply. Now, from that point on, I started to research training, and I started to look at what many people will know as mind control.
Right.
And I started to look at everything from religious cults to the Moonies, and I found that there was a huge amount of material written about it. And I began to see similarities between the Common Purpose training and these other cults. But what I could see was that Common Purpose was training people in a very mild, sophisticated way. We are Common Purpose, the charity. We are about diversity. We're about creating future leaders. We are about empowering society. It was all very reasonable stuff.
Yeah.
But what we knew is that within the 48-hour training, groups of people were being manipulated in front of each other, and the Common Purpose facilitators had the prior knowledge of each candidate, because each candidate had gone through this psychological screening that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Now, eventually, our research started to draw us towards neuro-linguistic programming. And at that point, we started to get the uneasy feeling that what we were actually watching was neuro-linguistic programming being used to actually change the social and political views of groups of people. And I can tell you that as time has gone on, we're understanding more and more and more about the power of neuro-linguistic programming. For those who've never heard